Loot systems. So, what's really the purpose of them? I think it depends largely on if it's a guild or if it's not a guild. Now, first, let's talk about pugs because this one's really, really easy to go over. Main spec over off spec is terrible. What's something that's really bad about it? It gives you no way to reward players who are more valuable. They have an equal chance of receiving any piece of loot, so people who have the most pieces to receive are the ones that are the most rewarded by showing up. These are not the people that are the most productive to your pug, okay? They have the least gear. Quite often, they're the least productive to your pug. What's another variation? Something plus one, which means that you get to get one piece from main spec to off spec, and then you get no other pieces unless nobody needs it for main spec. This is even worse than regular main spec off spec because you're very likely going to show somebody that, hey, you should just drop the group right now because you just got a piece and you're not going to get anything else. Bad incentive alignment. Terrible. What about soft reserve or two soft reserve? Now, I think 2SR is better because it makes it so there's less randomness. This probably works to 3 or 4 or 5 soft reserves, even depending on how many pieces of loot drop in the dungeon. You get what I mean. There's some ratio between the number of pieces that drop and the pieces that are this, and what the optimal number of soft reserves to allow is. What's nice about soft reserve, it helps make it so that way the best geared players, the most likely highest performing players, have not necessarily an edge at getting loot, but they're just not as hammered for being prepared. Let's assume there's 5 pieces of BIS and you're doing 1 SR. Well, at least that means that the people who are the most geared, that are each after maybe just 1 or 2 pieces, they can tactically make sure that there's limited competition on the pieces they want. Whereas the people who have every single slot open to take an upgrade on, they'll still have a big edge. They'll get more loot on average, but they just won't get as much of an edge as they would in MSOS. But soft reserve and main spec off spec, they both have a critical problem, and that's that once you've realized it's impossible for you to receive loot, either because the stuff that you wanted didn't drop and the rest of the dungeon has nothing you want, or you've already received one if it's a plus one, or you realize that your soft reserve is going to have a bunch more competition than you originally thought because maybe you're refilling because some people left due to those other reasons I mentioned, and now there's going to be a bunch of competition on a piece for a boss that you're trying to progress on in a fucking pug. All these things make people want to dip. This is what GDKP kind of solves. GDKP makes it so that way all the reward is right when you get over the finish line, which is nice because it turns out that the reasons to stay accelerate as you get further into the run. And if somebody dips, you're able to take somebody else in very easily because they're able to receive the reward for all the bosses they weren't there to kill. So their lockout has maybe the same value, you could say, as if they were there the whole time, but their money earned per time goes up. So it's got very good incentive alignment. But I'm just talking about for pugs. There are issues with GDKP, and we'll get into those in a moment. Now let's talk about guilds. Holy shit. Anything that's not GDKP, Loot Council, or DKP, except I guess for Loot List, if you know what that is, psychotic. You can't do any of the ones that aren't those 4 I mentioned. Basically, if your loot system allocates loot randomly, well, that's not very good. I think a primary reason why that's bad, and this is also a reason why GDKP I think is not great for a guild, is that when people receive an item, it doesn't feel as if the team got the item for them, as if there was a group effort. It really individualizes the success of gearing, and I think it makes people accidentally be very, very selfish. And even when they're not being selfish, it's quite easy for things that are supposed to be kind to seem like corruption. For example, have you ever been in a guild that does 2SR or MSOS and an officer wins a piece and then they end up not using it and trading it to somebody else instead? Now, one way to look at that is this officer's being really kind and they're passing up on a piece, but another way is maybe they didn't need that piece at all anyways. What's going on here? Are they trying to funnel more gear to people secretly? Usually, I don't think it'll actually be that nefarious one, but it does beg questions that need answers, and it's uncomfortable to ask questions about anything when the loot's handed out randomly, because you know that people are going to be like, what, you don't think it's fair? It's random. You think we rigged the dice? And it's like, no, bro. It's just, what the fuck is going on here? Now, I think Loot Council is the best system because you have a reason to be nice and cooperative in and out of raid, literally everywhere. If done well, I think that you can make the incentive structure fucking phenomenal. People can have a very clear idea of what they're going to receive, when they're going to receive it, why they will or why they will or won't get certain pieces. This is hard. It's usually not done well. You've probably been in a guild where Loot Council has been handled horrendously, where people have gotten loot that were terrible players, potentially that had terrible attitudes, or the worst thing ever, people who are threatening to quit and who maybe even aren't great players getting prioritized for loot over great players who are kind. You've probably seen this too. Kind players can get exploited in Loot Council very easily, even by very generous or nice, whatever positive attributes you want to assign to the people on Loot Council, just because it's very easy to be influenced by others. Now, how do you combat this on Loot Council? In my opinion, the notion of council fucks everything up. You should have very, very few people on Loot Council, because the less people you have on it, the more the failing of it reflects on an individual. And it makes it so that way somebody has a reason to be deeply concerned with all of the intricacies of the loot policy for the guild. If you have one guy on Loot Council, and maybe they're kind of responsible for keeping the roster staffed too, don't you think that they're naturally going to take being fair rather seriously? Or at least, and this would be bad, of course, at least they're going to try to figure out how to be very nefarious and con you into thinking they're being fair. Which wouldn't be a great thing. But you get what I mean. There is the chance for corruption in basically any loot system. In GDKP, the way you'd make things corrupt is that you'd create what appears to be fair rules, and then you'd rule lawyer people after the fact when you're cutting up money for the pot. That's how you try to be corrupt in a GDKP. And MSOS, you get people rolling on stuff when they don't really have an intention on using it, so that way you can move pieces around. 2SR, you can try to game when you lock in SRs. There's corruption available in any of these systems. Loot List, I actually don't know if there's a way to make it corrupt, but it's really complex. You can Google that if you're curious. I believe Apes use that loot system. Maybe they have their stuff online. I think Onslaught, that Horde guild that's really good, used it too. Anyways, I think Loot Council's the best. It has great incentive alignment. You just got to make sure there's very few people on it. That way, whenever something happens that's good or bad, there is a guy that you can go to in your guild to get a fucking answer about something. You can get certainty about who's going to get loot and why. And the reason I'd say that GDKP isn't as good as a Loot Council, even though you can create all this transparency and you can really, really create a simple contract that explains how everything's going to be handled, is not because of RMT or because people can do stuff outside a raid and get raid loot. I just think that when you're able to purchase loot with points that you have complete self-direction over, it erodes the sense of teamwork to get your gear. And you also have other weird stuff like, so what if somebody wants to swap what their main is? They didn't get geared up by the guild. They got geared up by their gold, by farming Black Lotus, by swiping their credit card, by showing up to runs on a character they didn't want to raid with. These are all arguments that could seem legitimate depending on who you are as to why you'd be able to swap what characters you're doing in a run, and why you wouldn't feel as if you owe something to your team, which I think is the best part about Loot Council. It really binds everyone together, unless it's done poorly and then it fucks everything up, and I'm sure we've all been there before. But, you can find a guild that doesn't fuck it all up. Click my other videos if you think this is interesting, and I'm streaming every day now. Peace.